Is the auditor going to join us?
I think they said she might try if she can't.
Okay. All right. Well, for the record, Director, I will recognize that we have a quorum, and if the auditor joins us, I will be glad to record that. So,
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a publicly noticed special meeting for the State Loan and Investment Board. On the agenda today are two matters. They are related to setting up two of the three American Rescue Plan Act programs that the Wyoming legislature has tasked the State Loan and Investment Board with setting up and administering. The first matter, C1, is to consider adoption of emergency rules for State Loan and Investment Board Rules and Regulations, Chapter 40, Health and Human Services Capital Construction ARPA grants, and consider authorizing the regular rulemaking process, Chapter 40, Health and Human Services Capital Construction ARPA grants. The proposed draft Chapter 40 rules govern the Health and Human Services Capital Construction ARPA grants program. The program, as I mentioned, was created during the 2022 budget session of the Wyoming legislature. The legislation provided rulemaking authority to the State Loan and Investment Board and appropriated $85 million to the board for distribution related to health and human services capital construction projects. Of that appropriation, $63 million is available to any applicant for qualifying projects. $7 million is available only to community mental health center regional stabilization facilities and women's substance use disorder facilities for qualifying projects. $13 million is available only to rural health clinics for qualifying projects, and $2 million is available only to eligible rural telehealth pilot projects. The proposed rules are based on the ARPA final rule promulgated by the U.S. Treasury and the requirements of the authorizing state legislation. All grants issued by the board must meet applicable federal eligibility requirements, and all projects funded must be a direct and proportionate response to COVID-19 or its negative economic impacts. All funds have to be obligated by December 31st of 2024 and fully expended by December 31st, 2026. Although not required, as part of the emergency rulemaking process, the Office of State Lands and Investments did solicit written public comments on this proposed rule. A summary of those comments received was compiled and provided to the board, and as noted in our summary document, several changes were made to the original version of the draft rules based on that public comment. So in order for the board to begin the program and begin awarding grant funding, we are recommending that the board adopt the draft emergency rules for Chapter 40, and for long-term administration purposes, allow the OSLI to kick off the regular rulemaking process for, again, Chapter 40, the Health and Human Services Capital Construction Grants Program. And with your permission, Mr. Chairman, I would yield the floor to Pat Miller from the Attorney General's office to kind of take the board through the proposed rule.
good morning. Thank you, Director, and Mr. Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So these rules are largely similar to the CARES rules, but have been adapted to ARPA. The CARES rules were the basis for this chapter, and then we have adjusted them as the federal program has changed. In particular, we have divided the appropriation into two different types of funds. Broad eligibility funds are the $63 million that are appropriated by the legislature and available for any eligible HHS project. Narrow eligibility funds are the $22 million that the legislature has set aside in footnotes, $7 million to community mental health center regional stabilization facilities and women's substance use disorder facilities to use for capital construction projects. $13 million are set aside for rural health clinics for qualifying human health and services infrastructure projects, and then $2 million are available to grants for eligible rural telehealth pilot projects. And so the rules are set up so that if a project qualifies for one of those narrow eligibility funding areas, it will first draw from those funds, leaving the broad eligibility funds untouched if possible. Those will be preserved as much as possible while we use up the narrow funds. But if it doesn't qualify for narrow funds, it would be eligible for broad funds. Section 6 deals with the ARPA eligibility justification. This chapter was largely cut and paste from the Federal Treasury guidance. These are reporting requirements that we are required to give to the Treasury for our major capital construction projects. And so applicants will be required to fill out that justification so that we have the required information to report to Treasury. The application procedure is set up so that the office can notice one or more application periods. I believe that the current hope is to have a single application period, sort through all of the applications that come in and disperse all of the money at a single special meeting. But if it turns out that there is additional funding available after that meeting, if funds are returned after projects are bid, the board has the authority to open up a second application period or even a third, depending on how circumstances play themselves out. The applications will run through the Office of State Lands, which has the authority to determine how those applications will be submitted. The required information is in Section 7C and is largely standard for the office's application process. I will note that we did have a change that I believe has been made to the Section C, subsection 5. It is up to date on the website, but I believe it may have changed since you got your packets, and that was a relatively simple change. The original wording where we were asking for a report on all federal money that had been received was a little bit unclear. The wording was inartful. So we have changed that so that it now says the amount of all federal and state loans, grants, or aid the applicant has received for COVID-19 related purposes, and a brief summary of how the funds were spent. So that is simply to inform the board what other funds were available to the applicant. That is not something that is going to be scored by the office or anything. It is simply for the board's information. Moving down, we have ineligible project expenses, which are standard to OSLI, supplemented by the federal guidance. And then we have match funding, which is an area that we may want to discuss a bit more later. The legislation sets up a 50% match funding requirement for all projects, and then gives the board the authority to modify that if the board makes a determination of need. The current setup is to allow applicants essentially a year, a little over a year after they are awarded grants to raise that match funding. So all match funding must be raised and committed, verified by the office prior to the disbursement of any funds. But the board may conditionally award grants to applicants that do not yet have their match funding committed, provided that they meet certain benchmarks as they raise those funds. And that is to give applicants more time to raise the required match funding, but also to allow the board to redeploy that money if it looks like the match funding is not going to be raised. So a third needs to be raised within 6 months of the award, 66% needs to be raised within a year of the award, and then the full amount needs to be raised no later than December 31st, 2023 to allow the board a year to redeploy those funds if applicants have not raised the required match funding. In section B, subsection B, we have the requirements for a determination of need, and the office's recommendation is currently that the board award a 5% reduction if it determines there is need based on a list of criteria. Those criteria include population, average median household income, the proportion of the population living below the federal poverty level, and whether the applicant has received funding. So that would count towards match funding. And they would, the recommendation is that for each of these criteria that applicants can satisfy, they would be eligible for a 5% reduction. And we can certainly adjust that list if the board would like to add criteria or remove criteria. And I would note that I believe the application that is, or the version of the rules that is online does not have the applicant's unemployment rate listed as one of the criteria, but we would recommend including that as an additional criteria, whether the application's unemployment rate or the unemployment rate of the applicant's primary service area is equal to or greater than the state median. And that's a criteria that the office is familiar with using. Finally, we have in-kind contributions, which can serve as a potential source of match funding. Those must be reasonably and easily valued at fair market value, and then the board will ultimately determine what that valuation is. Section 10 deals with the evaluation of applications. The board has final discretion in how to evaluate applications. These are the criteria that the board should use to do that, and to assist the board in prioritizing among eligible projects, the office will compute a scorecard for each applicant, and those are all listed in subsection B. That score is entirely advisory on the board. The board can choose to disregard it and prioritize projects however it wishes, but that is simply one tool that the office can provide the board for guidance. And then finally, we have fund disbursement. The funds will revert to the office so that the office can and the board can redeploy them shortly before they revert to the federal government. And then there was some confusion during the comment period as to when costs needed to be incurred. Under the federal guidance and in fact the federal regulations, costs must be incurred by December 31st, 2024, and the Treasury considers costs incurred when they have been obligated. So obligation must occur by the end of 2024, and then funds must be dispersed and completely spent by the end of 2026. And then in the section on disbursement and administration, the office has October of both of those years to get that money back in order to make sure that things are we're able to redeploy if possible, and that all of our reporting is going to be done on time.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Any questions from the board? Mr. Treasurer.
A couple of things there, I guess. You know, one of the things that I've seen in a lot of the different programs, whether it's this or ones that's at WCDA or different ones, community block grants, there seems to be the state leases, the actual form in the application, and when that form has to be completed, what has to be in those forms, and the timeliness of that. The board has very, very little, I guess, flexibility to waive or ask for remedy of any of those deficiencies that may occur, you know, later on in the process. And so is there any, I guess, for cause authority that the board would have to remedy any you know, potential deficiency in either the application in timeliness or omission or any other factor that may exist? And I know that the CDBG, they had some problems where the federal government had a standard which we couldn't necessarily vacate, but I didn't know whether the board has any authority at all to address any issue that might come up that was just, you know, a Scribner's error or anything else like that.
Mr. Miller.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Treasurer, the board does have the authority to extend the application period as long as it hasn't expired yet. Under the rules as drafted, once the application period has expired, it has expired, and late applications are not considered timely. There is no...
And that's a federal application, drop dead date or expiration.
No, Mr. Treasurer, that's based on your rules. For the application deadline, to get applications into the office for your consideration, that's how your rules are currently set up. If the board would like to change that, we can certainly do that.
So if somebody shows up a day late, they're $1 million short.
Correct, Mr. Treasurer. I will add that there is a preliminary review by the office, and if they determine that some information is missing, they notify the applicant, and the applicant has the opportunities to submit that. So a completely late application would not be timely, but an application that's, say, missing some things that are not discovered until after the application deadline, they would still have 5 days from being notified of
That's in the
that.
rules that allows the department to do that, but there's no board authority for any cause or anything like that. Say the city council was, I'm not wishing this on any city councils, but they had some, I guess, interruption in their ability to perform their duties.
That is correct, Mr. Treasurer. It is in Section 7, subsection F, is where the applicant will have 5 days from being notified that their application is missing things to supply that information to the board. But there is currently no provision in Section 7 that would allow the board to waive the application deadline.
Is that 5 days of receiving the notification or 5 days? So you could send it out in the mail and they got it 4 days later, it would be on that 4th day?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Treasurer, how our standard practice in our office has been since I arrived 10 years ago approximately, has been our due dates, the final date of that period, they can apply anytime before, submit it anytime before. We like early applications. However, our application due dates have always been hard and fast of 5 o'clock on the date that they're due. The purpose being, if we make one exception, we're going to have to make millions of exceptions. We have discussed with this application process that we would receive our applications by certified mail to allow entities, as long as you put your application in the mail to be delivered by the 5 o'clock on the due date, we would accept those. The reason being is during CARES, it became very chaotic, and we're trying to learn from lessons. We're trying to employ lessons learned during CARES. And so truly, if we're going to be expecting 50 to 100 applications to come in, or even more, it serves everyone's interest so that we can document this application was put in the mail at this time and we received it in our office at this time. Because what we ran into in CARES is a lot of people said, well, I sent my stuff in, but we never received it. So whether they did or not, we don't know. Whether it got lost in central mail, got lost in the regular mail, it just, it makes things very, very difficult on my staff and on the review committees to just have the due date waived, in the sense that that prohibits us to vet that application in the same manner that we vetted all applications against all other applications. It makes it difficult, because then we're always trying to update our information. The other thing is, generally, if an applicant is waiting on a board or a council meeting to sign their resolution, a lot of times we'll take their application as long as their board meeting is within a week or two. We're very good at working with our entities in that sense. However, there has to be a line in the sand for my staff to truly process the application in an orderly and timely and consistent manner. And I think that's the most important thing, that all applications are being vetted in the same fashion against one another, using the same standards. It's just difficult when you have a straggler. You've kind of forgot about some of those others maybe. And so, but I do feel like my staff, if someone, like I said, the resolution is generally the thing that people have a hiccup on. One of the other things this year may be getting their 2021 audit reports. So if they haven't received that, they can send us a letter from their auditor stating we're engaged, we just haven't been able to do it. And that's normal right now, especially.
Mr. Chairman?
Sure. Mr.
So
Treasurer.
to the specific question I asked, that you said you have 5 days, and is that 5 days from when you sent the second request for it to fill something out? Or is it 5 days from the time that they received it?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Treasurer, generally, we communicate with our entities via phone or email, so we wouldn't be mailing anything back to them. It would be an immediate communication, and it would be 5 business days from the time that, generally, we give them 5 business days to get that information to us. We send it, but we send it via email. We always follow up with an email.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Treasurer. Further questions? Further questions? Okay.
Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to add one thing to make sure the board was aware. This is a group effort, if you will, with the Department of Health and the Department of Family Services. And in fact, we have Director Stefan Johansson and Director Corin Schmid here. They and their staff will be helping us evaluate the Health and Human Services application. So we understand this isn't exactly within our wheelhouse. We do obviously grants and grant programs all the time, but it truly is a group effort here.
Thank you, Madam Director. Would either Director Johansson or Director Schmidt have any comments they'd like to tender? Seeing shaking heads in a no fashion, that's fine. Mr. Secretary, any comments or questions?
The only question I had, Mr. Chairman, was on the obligated, when funds are obligated. I'm assuming that means when we've awarded it, not when an entity has signed some type of contract.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Miller.
Mr. Secretary, we are going to have to look into that a little bit more. I believe it may come down to the distinction between whether this is a subrecipient or a vendor relationship, and I don't believe we've gotten that nailed down yet. But it is a distinct possibility that the entity itself will have to have entered into a contract by the obligated deadline.
All right, I'll just kind of keep that in the back of our minds as we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Well, very good.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes. Oh, that's the auditor. Good to have you on board. Thank you.
thank you, Mr. Chairman. One quick question for staff. Per my math, I'm just rough math. It's looking like the max that we could reduce the match for an entity if they check all the boxes is 30%, or is it going to be 35 if we also incorporate the unemployment statistic? That was my only question.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Miller.
Madam Auditor, it would be 30% because the first 2 criteria that are currently in the rules are mutually exclusive. The first is whether you are a county, city, or town, and then the second is whether you're a special district NGO. So those two, you
Okay.
can't meet both. So the
Gotcha.
max match, if we incorporate unemployment rate, would be 30%. I believe there's 7 criteria. You can meet 6 if you have extreme need, and so that would be a 30% reduction to a 20% required match.
So as written right now, it's 25%.
As written right now, you could meet 6 criteria, reducing the match by 30%, and so the required match would be a 20% match. We could include additional criteria if the board would like, including a catch-all for other good cause, something along those lines. But as it's currently drafted, 20% would be the maxed, or the lowest possible match requirement.
Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Treasurer.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, what's the federal government, do they have a minimum match that has to occur?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Treasurer, this is a state requirement that the legislature has put in place, the match. There is no federal match requirement for this particular program.
Okay.
Okay, further questions from the board? Let me then open it for general comments. I see Jeremiah Riemann is here from the counties. Mr. Riemann, are there any comments you'd like to offer? And then I have Brad Bowen, Marilyn Connolly, Mikey Madrid, and Tiffany Marshall that I see as attendees. So if you have any comments, please just raise your hand. Mr. Riemann.
Good morning, Governor, members of the board. I'm Jeremiah Riemann here on behalf of the Wyoming County Commissioners Association. If it pleases you, Governor, I'd like to actually address both rules because my comments will essentially be the same, and I'd like to save you a little bit of time. First off, I'd like to extend our appreciation that these resources exist. The fact that we have this program, the water and wastewater project program, and future programs, including the local government funds and matching funds for federal infrastructure, are significant, and we certainly appreciate that. That was in some ways unanticipated by local governments, and all the more appreciation comes forward. I also want to extend my appreciation to the staff. There were meaningful changes in these rules as a result of our comments. I'm going to speak to just two provisions quickly. First one is actually in the water and sewer program. It's a very nominal change that I would suggest to you, and that's on page 41-1. It's in the definition of eligible projects. It's just an administrative change. There's a reference to 31 CFR, and it says 31. That 31 should actually be a 35. It's consistent throughout the rest of the rules, but just wanted to make note that that change had not been made.
Mr. Miller, and I realize we're a bit out of order here, but.
Mr. Chairman, he's absolutely correct. We believed we had made the change. It didn't make it into the draft that is on the website. It has been changed though and noted. So I sincerely appreciate the site checking.
Thank you. Please proceed, Mr. Riemann.
Governor, the second one, and this goes to, again, both programs. It was cited earlier in the conversation. It's in Section 7. In the healthcare program world, it's in Section 7, Provision C, Romanet 5. In the water and wastewater, it's Romanet 7. We certainly appreciate the desire for the board to evaluate the capacity of local governments to participate in the funding of these projects. Certainly have no issue with that. This provision requests two things. One, the amount of funds that were received for COVID-related purposes, and two, a brief summary of fund expenditures. Do appreciate that change from a detailed report to a brief summary. That certainly was meaningful. But I do want to just point out that in responding to this provision, I'm thinking about the administrative capacity of local governments. If you're looking at counties, there are 5 counties with grant writers. The remaining 18 do not have grant writing capacity, and so in some instances, we have commissioners that are writing these grants, and I think of your home county governor, Commissioner Bill Novotny, is their grant writer. And so what we had suggested is that I think what's most relevant to you is not the universe of the COVID-related grants, loans, and other funds that counties had received, but rather those that were available to be expended for healthcare or water and sewer projects or for whatever the intended purpose was. That will cut down on the administrative burden at the local level. So rather than counties having to report that they received $5 million for PPE or granted out funds to nonprofits, we'll simply be reporting on those funds that can be matched here, again, towards that capacity to participate in this. So we have provided some draft language in our comments that I would just draw your attention to. To the second provision about how those funds were spent, That has left many commissioners wondering, what is the intent? I think the most important intent here is to ensure that we get you information about our capacity to participate in that matching. And so we've proposed some changes there. To that point about our capacity, it is true that counties received or will receive roughly $112 million in ARPA-related funds. That varies from Niobrara County at $450,000 up to here in Laramie County, which is going to receive roughly just under $20 million. But the universe of how these funds can be matched or used for other purposes is quite large. And so I would just ask for your discretion as you're reviewing that capacity to understand that we have these two programs, we have a state program, and working with our national counterparts, we've developed a 19-page document that shows the 92 other programs that through the bipartisan infrastructure plan, counties will be looking to evaluate their expenditures. So understand that the universe is large when you consider that capacity. With that, Governor, again, I would just direct you to our comments for our recommendations for changing this provision, not to try and hide anything, but to provide ultimately more relevant, we think, information to the process. And with that, Governor, I would stand for any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Raymond. You know, I'm going to ask the auditor if she's still on. You know, my concern, Mr. Raymond, and I appreciate that we don't want to burden people, and I know we have small communities and counties that are significantly smaller than some of our larger cities, and obviously the capacity of the staff to deal with that is somewhat challenged. However, I also think that there's going to be audit statements that are required, and I guess mindful of the fact that, you know, knock on wood, so far, I think Wyoming has been diligent in making sure that, you know, it is a fairly precise exercise on how we spend these federal dollars, and that's saved us from some headache, I suppose. I'm just curious if those audit statements would be of some help in sort of describing how these funds are used, because I do think there's a significant amount of expertise gap, but there's also an enormous amount of information gap, and I do understand what you're saying, but simply having a small community that's gathered up a lot of funding and hasn't spent it yet, you know, in some ways could penalize others that were more, you know, needy and perhaps in some ways.
Governor, if I can, I think our comments and our proposed change to this provision get to that. We ask for a detailed explanation of how they arose at the matching funding that they might provide for this particular project, assuming that they're going to do that. So we want to provide that information. And the only other thing I would say, Governor, relative to auditing is that I don't think that's the state's purpose with this grant program, nor do you need to assume that burden. My entities will be responsible for the same reporting requirements that that the state of Wyoming is under ARPA. So we're going to have to be reporting to the U.S. Treasury in the same manner that you are relative to the use of these funds, and that's public record. We'd be happy to provide that information.
Okay, thank you. Madam Auditor, let me just ask if you have any concerns.
Yeah, a couple of random thoughts, and thank you, Jeremiah, for your comments. They're super relevant. So he's correct in the sense that each one of those entities that receive direct ARPA funding will have to report as the state does. However, it is on a substantially lower level, and not to say that it's easy, none of it's easy. It is not near at the level that the state has to report just based on the entity and the type of funding received. His comments, I think, were very good in regards to, could we narrow the scope of grants? But my concern there, for example, is if we say something along the lines of ARPA funding that is eligible for water projects, I've had conversations with different entities that are managing their own ARPA funds. And this is not being critical. This is what we're all battling against. There are folks who don't understand what their funds are applicable for. I've had conversations that with folks that don't recognize that if they receive less than $10 million, that they can essentially be used for anything. So I don't think narrowing it to and asking, what we only want to hear about the monies that you receive that could have been used for water projects is a good solution, because there's not necessarily a good understanding of that. If we were to narrow our scope a little bit, I think, and sorry, Mr. Chairman, I'll tell you while I'm talking, I'm just sort of getting out all my comments on this section right now. If we were to narrow it to any extent, what I would be really interested in hearing is CARES money and direct ARPA money. And again, I agree with everything Jeremiah said, but if there's a county that, for example, received $8 million and they've spent none of it, that doesn't necessarily mean they don't have a good plan for it. But that, to me, as a board member, that's going to be something I take into account, as to where we direct our funds. And then one last thing, Mr. Chairman, you asked about the audit function on the back end. The expenditure of those funds will be captured in audits at the local level, but not in a manner that's timely enough for us to use that information to make decisions. So like an example, if the city of Cheyenne hasn't spent a whole lot of money, they haven't really reported on it, and therefore we don't really have anything to look at to see, oh, okay, we think we've spent their money well, and this is, a place where we should put more money. Sorry, Mr. Chair, did that even come close to answering your question?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Auditor. I sort of wonder about the same thing. If the diligence is the diligence, whether it comes before or after, but the information can be used twice if it comes before. So
Exactly, yes.
I do appreciate the comments, though, and I do, absolutely understand the challenges of filling out government paperwork. So appreciate that. Any questions, further questions for Mr. Riemann? I don't believe we do. Thank you, Mr. Riemann. Marilyn Connolly is in the attendees, and Ms. Connolly, I would be glad to recognize you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I put a note in the chat. My question would be this morning is it possible to use mineral royalty grant funding that's been awarded towards this ARPA project for the match?
Thank you, Marilyn. I think what Ms. Connolly is asking if we can use MRG funds to match this funding. Is that correct, Ms. Connolly?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Miller.
Mr. Chairman, match funding may come from any source that may be legally used to match the board's funds. So in this case, we're not aware of any MRG restrictions on that, and it would certainly fit within the state legislation, which says from any source.
Thank you. Any questions for Ms. Connolly, or Ms. Connolly, do you have any further questions?
Mr. Chairman, no, I just appreciate the work that's gone into this, and this rulemaking process is something that I'm not super familiar with, but it seems a pretty hard task, and I just appreciate the work you're all doing on it. And I think these funds are going to be so important to our local rural communities, especially. My interest is in the health side of things. So just thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Marilyn. Further, are there other, I see Commissioner Greeno is on. Are there any other questions? Any other questions? Hearing none. What's the pleasure of the board on these? We can do, I think probably if these are adequate, or if we want to consider changes to section 7, Roman at 5, C5. Just what's your thoughts? Mr. Treasurer, I see you sitting forward.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I'm sympathetic, I think, to the county commissioners' I guess arguments here. This is one of those areas that it's in the application procedure, and if it takes, you're saying you're going to have 5 days or 15 days, to put this together and everything else. This seems like you're going to have a lot of people that will just throw up their hands and say, well, we can't do it in 15 days, so I guess that blocks us out. I'm just wondering how the timelines work with Section 5.
Mr. Chairman,
Madam Director.
Mr. Treasurer, the application period will be open for 4 to 6 weeks, so they should have plenty of time to put that information together. The 5 days, I believe, that you were speaking of is what Ms. Blackwell was talking about with when they get an application, if there's something that's deficient, that's when they can speak with the applicant and hopefully remedy that in 5 days.
Yeah, I just think that it's if there's a way to streamline it, put it on some kind of a form or something where they can check a box rather than get a lot of details. I can understand, the concerns about people banking grant funds and different things like that. But I think the counties put forth something that would work for them, and I don't know why it really won't work for us. Can you tell me why it won't work for us, specifically from where this is to where the counties would like to see it go?
While Ms. Blackwell is looking for that, I guess, Treasurer, one of my concerns is if we make it so that there aren't hard and fast deadlines or some diligence, this board will have to consider every one of the applications without the benefit of an equal footing on them. And I think that, I think this board is inclined to extend grace as we can. But I think just having stuff show up after the deadline without complete materials will make our job a lot more difficult. And I think.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I agree with you as far as the equal footing argument. I'm just wondering whether or not, because there's not equal capacity, whether or not there's a way to streamline this or to define these Section 5 requirements to where they aren't cumbersome. I'd hate to have the application so cumbersome that it makes it just that cumbersome and administratively prohibited.
Mr. Miller.
Mr. Chairman, would it be helpful to have me read the language the county commissioners submitted in their comments for an alternative
That
section?
would be helpful. I was trying to walk through this and find them.
Absolutely. So this is, I don't know which page of the packet, but it's in their comments on section 7C5.
Okay, so.
And it's, the proposed alternative is the amount of all federal loans, grants, or aid provided for COVID-19 related purposes including from ARPA or other similarly purposed federal acts for which the recipient has received that are eligible for investment in water and sewer, and I presume that means HHS infrastructure for this particular chapter, and the amount the applicant proposes as matching funds for eligible, again, water and sewer, I think they mean HHS projects, if any, and detail on how that amount was determined. So I think the major change there would be the recipient would be making a determination as to whether those funds are eligible for investment in this case, HHS infrastructure, whereas the rules as drafted just say, give us everything. You don't have to make any eligibility determinations. This would say, if it's eligible for investment, then you tell the board.
Mr. Miller, just to follow up on that, though, I thought the original provisions, and I'm sitting here looking at that, but I thought the original provisions also contemplated what you had expended, and this would not. So in other words, am I misreading that?
No, Mr. Chairman, that is also correct. It doesn't look like there's any expenditure reporting here. It would just be if you're going to put it as a match fund or
So
not.
if I wanted to build a hospital, say, somewhere, I could say, I hope to be able to build this hospital. Here's the money I'm going to use for it. Give me as much money as you possibly can, and we'll call it good. I don't mean to oversimplify it, and Mr. Riemann, you can certainly respond to that, but I guess I think occasionally some of these projects and hospitals are one of those that I worry about, where then it becomes a burden on the taxpayers after there's no federal funding left. Commissioners made those determinations in good stead with good reasons and everything else, but now the taxpayers are trying to figure out how to keep a hospital open. So that would be my concern with the commissioner's language. Mr. Riemann,
Governor, if I can, just quickly, first off, I should say that, in most instances, counties are not going to be applying for either one of these programs. Most of them are not involved in water and wastewater projects. That is done through special districts and others. Hospitals, with a couple of exceptions, are not owned by counties. But we're looking at these rules because we understand that they may be the basis for the forthcoming programs that are coming. Governor, we're not opposed to the notion of providing you dollar figures about how much was spent of the COVID-related funding that we have. If you want to include that as part of this, that's perfectly fine. The administrative element is, and this got better, as I mentioned in my earlier comments, it was, instead of a detailed, it's now a brief summary. It still requires us to report out how we spent those funding, which is an administrative process of going back and looking at that. Second, the timelines for this, we still have another couple of years in order to make those expenditures. And third, I will admit that some local governments are worried about, okay, is this going to be a political wrangling where you're now going to say, well, you spent it on this, and that seems inappropriate when you could have spent it here. So we're just trying to make this a better product and provide you with a recommendation. If you want to put something in there about us reporting out how much of that money has been expended, I don't think we have an issue with that.
okay, Ms. Blackwell.
I think the point of this question, just for everyone's information and where it came from staff, is the fact that we're regularly asked, whether in a public meeting or in our briefings, what did this entity spend their ARPA funds on, since ARPA funds have been available. We're trying to prevent a situation where an entity may be asked on the fly to provide that information, rather providing it upfront to the board, giving the entities 4 to 6 weeks to get that information gathered to provide it to us. This requirement was very thoughtful in the sense of, we don't want an entity to be blindsided or not have that information available as it is something that's regularly requested of staff to provide to the board when they're making their funding decisions.
And I think that's an auditor's standard question almost immediately.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, that is, and I can assure you, and I apologize for jumping in, but I can assure you, I will ask every applicant that anyway, if it's not provided. So for what it's worth, I think it's very useful. And when they don't have any idea, and that's certainly concerning. And I think there won't be, at least not from me. I don't think it's so much a judgment on, yes, we had money and we've spent it all. It's a question of, oh yeah, we had $4 million and we're still doing surveys to try to figure out what to do with it. Those are the kind of things that are sort of that might be a red flag to Jeremiah's concern about, well, what if we didn't spend it right, correctly? I'm more concerned of, was there a plan? Did you get it done? Is it closed out? Or what you haven't spent, is there a plan for that? Are you moving the ball down the field?
And just to follow up on that, Auditor, I think one of my longstanding concerns with the way this board has dealt over its time with MRG grants and others is that I think it is very poor form for us to penalize people for having reserves. And it was a typical thing to sort of penalize people and say, well, you had reserves, you could have spent it on this. And so we forced everybody into an emergency funding scenario. I think you're really talking about good management if you've taken some time and had a plan. So I guess, is there, I mean, I understand the notion here and I understand the burden. I do think the treasurer made a comment about whether there could be a simplified form. I don't know how burdensome this is, but I think the auditor's point about having a plan and whether you've met it, most everyone would be able to sort of give that notion, I think. Wouldn't they, Mr. Riemann, sorry.
Governor, can you help me with that question? I make sure.
Well, I guess what the auditor is saying is it would be nice if, an applicant said, here's how this money came to us, this is how we plan to use it, and this is pretty much how we have used it, and here are the timelines we've met and the reasons why we haven't. And I would think almost everyone would have some, and I thought this question really went to sort of the broad scope of that rather than, a detailed spreadsheet with every receipt on it and how it was spent and so on. And I thought that was the intent of why this provision was loosened. But I'm thinking if a government shows up and says, we got some money, I don't know what we're going to do with it, but we've done some other projects.
Governor, let me just be very clear. If this provision stays as is, we will abide by it and be able to provide that information. I think it varies across the state in terms of where counties, and that's who I represent. But let's be honest, in terms of this funding, largely this went to counties, municipalities, and others. But at least in the county side, I have some that are really sophisticated and have that detail and would be able to provide it and have made decisions. Others are still in that process and may be in that process for a bit more time because one, they haven't received their second payment of the total amount, or they have working groups that are working through that process trying to make decisions. And part of that may be we want to invest in this. Part of that may be those other 92 programs that I mentioned in that other document. It is a fluid process, and it really is dependent on the community that you're in.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Raymond.
Mr. Chairman,
Madam Auditor.
I would, and again, I'm not sure how the other members of the board or the counties would feel about this, but what I would be most interested in is how much CARES Act money have they gotten from the state? That's likely going to be from the state. And what have they done with their own direct ARPA allocations, or have they gotten an ARPA allocation? For example, a special district, have they received money from a county? So I would certainly be willing to narrow it down to CARES, CARES direct money. And I apologize, I forget the actual name of that program. That was the 1.25 billion that the state got, and then ARPA, the SLFRF funds. But again, I'm just throwing that out there as an option. I don't know if other members of the board or you still want to hear about the other. But to the county's point, the 40 different funding streams of medical funds that they received for PPE, I'm less interested in that, but I don't know how the rest of the board feels. That was all.
Madam Blackwell, Ms. Blackwell.
Mr. Chairman, I just took a quick look at our draft Health and Human Services application. It's 20 pages, but it's 11 pages, but only 20 questions. The majority of those questions are related to the required information that is contained in the federal regulation that we must obtain, such as please describe the harm that was done. Please describe how it was exacerbated or caused by COVID-19. Those are things that we have to ask. We would be happy to add a page within our application that they can choose either to provide a detailed, paragraph summary, thank you. Summary of what they spent it on, or below it, they can choose to use, we can create a form or a table within there that they could utilize, similar to what's on the front of all of our applications that show their match funding. So we could do something very simple like that.
Mr. Riemann, I'm wondering if that makes some sense to you, and I guess I'm also wondering if there's any reason why we, instead of the amount of all, we could just strike all. We could add federal CARES direct, and then the auditor, you said ARPA SRF funds?
Mr. Chairman, I'm guessing Beth can correct that. It's state local fiscal recovery funds. It's the specific stream from ARPA from which the state received its money, and then that is where the direct money went to all counties and all municipalities in the state.
Thank you, Madam Auditor. Ms. Blackwell.
Mr. Chairman, I believe we would want all their CARES Act that they were awarded, their ARPA direct funds, and then the ARPA SLRF. Yeah, the acronym everyone is saying that starts with
Yeah.
S.
I think, Mr. Chairman, you say it SLFRF.
That helps.
Okay. So, Mr. Riemann,
So, Governor, if I can, just relative to CARES Act, with very few exceptions, and they would be a very small number, the rest of the CARES Act funding came direct from the state. Either it came from the Department of Health for PPE or Homeland Security, and to help with the local nursing programs through the CARES Act program that you all administered. So frankly, Governor, you already have that information. We're just going to be regurgitating that back. I do think it helps to narrow it if we can put it to those specific CARES Act funds that were distributed out, and in some ways eliminate the PPE components of it that may be less relevant to this conversation. And I think narrowing it to that state and local fund portion of ARPA, that makes sense to me. That will remove some administrative burden. That's the most important component of trying to remove the administrative burden. And I think what the department is suggesting in terms of forms that can be submitted in on, I don't know that I have an issue with that.
thank you, Mr. Riemann. So, Ms. Blackwell, do you Do you have a distilling of the language there that would be helpful? Or Mr. Miller?
Mr. Chairman, with your permission, I can share my screen to the
Sure.
meeting. Can you, I will make it as large as I possibly can.
We can, but let's see what this Pat has. Do you need permission to share the screen, or have you got it?
I believe I have permission. My computer needs permission, though. Tell you what, I can drop it into the chat bar. That way we can see it. It's going to be the amount of any CARES grants awarded by the state and any ARPA state and local fiscal recovery funds the applicant has received. And a brief summary of how those were spent.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Superintendent.
could you say that one more time, please?
Mr. Chairman, the amount of any CARES grants awarded by the state and any ARPA state and local fiscal recovery funds the applicant has received, and a brief summary of how the funds were spent.
Mr. Chairman, perhaps at the very end, we could add comma or plan to be spent.
I agree with the auditor's suggestion there.
That has been implemented.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Auditor. Thank you, Mr. Superintendent. Mr. Secretary, any comments, thoughts, questions?
I like that language, and I would move for adoption of that amendment.
Yeah, that language has been moved. Is there a second? It's
Second?
been seconded by the treasurer, the superintendent, 1 second late. Any discussion? Any further discussion? All right, that motion carries, so that language is now included in what's before us.
Mr. Chairman, did we actually vote?
Not yet. I'm trying to sort of figure out my point here, Madam Auditor, because we have not got the rules specifically moved yet, so.
Gotcha, thank you.
All in favor, signify by saying aye.
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 Okay, that carries. Very good. Now, what's the pleasure on the rules?
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Treasurer?
I would move the director's recommendations as amended to the attached draft rules for Chapter 40, Health and Human Services Capital Construction ARPA grants.
So that motion has been made. Is there a second? Is there a second?
Second?
It's been seconded by the
Mr. Chairman,
It has been seconded, but Madam Auditor, I'll recognize you.
yes, Mr. Chairman, just one question before we vote. Is the unemployment component of the match reduction currently included? I'm looking at it and I just want to make sure that we know whether that's in there or not currently.
Mr. Miller?
Mr. Chairman, Madam Auditor, that is not in the draft that was attached to the board matter, but that was recommended by the director to be included in the final rules that pass. So I believe we're good with the motion that we've got. If you would like to make it a friendly to add that to the amendments, you can do that, but I believe we're good as we are.
Mr.
Thank you.
Treasurer,
That was my only question.
Did you want to amend your motion to include that language?
Mr. Chairman, for clarity, I will amend my motion to include that language.
Thank you. Is that okay with the second? Okay, it's been moved and seconded as clarified. Any discussion? Any further discussion? Any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Okay, thank you. That motion carries. Chapter 40 rules are adopted.
Okay, so Mr. Chairman, that the director's rec was that option B, is that right?
That is correct.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
So, Mr. Miller.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, are we ready to move on to C2?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, the next item on the agenda is C2, which is to consider adoption of emergency rules for State Loan and Investment Board Rules and Regs, Chapter 41, Water and Sewer, ARPA grants, consider authorizing the regular rulemaking process for Chapter 41. So the proposed draft Chapter 41 rules govern water and sewer ARPA grants. The program was created during the 2022 budget session of the Wyoming Legislature and provided rulemaking authority to the board. The legislation appropriated to the board $50 million for the program. The appropriation is for competitive grant funding to cities, counties, special districts, and tribal governments for eligible water and wastewater projects. The maximum grant for any single project is $7,500,000, and each grant is conditioned upon a match of funds in the ratio of 85 cents of grant funds to not less than 15 cents from matching funds. The provisions of the draft rule are based on guidance provided by the U.S. Treasury Department, supplemented by the requirements of the authorizing state legislation. All grants issued must meet applicable federal eligibility. Funds must be obligated by December 31st, 2024, and fully spent by December 31st, 2026. Although not required, again, as part of the rulemaking process, the Office of State Lands and Investments did solicit written public comments on these draft rules. A summary of the public comments received by OSLI was compiled and provided to the board, and the summary that we provided for the board matter notes where changes were made to the draft rules in response to those public comments. In order for the board to begin awarding grant funding for this program in a timely manner and to allow for administration of the program, emergency rules must be adopted, as well as for the long-term administration, regular rules must also be adopted. So the office is seeking for the board to adopt emergency rules and to authorize OSLI to begin the regular rulemaking process with respect to the draft Chapter 41 eligible water and sewer projects ARPA grant funding. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I would yield the floor to Mr. Miller to go through the proposed rule.
Thank you, Madam Director. Mr. Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. These rules cover largely the same ground covered by the last ones. I will just note some of the differences. The legislation for this particular program sets the match funding, so the board does not need to entertain any requests to modify it. The legislation requires a 15% match as a minimum. Applicants can certainly provide more, but the 15% match is the minimum. And then these funds, because they are awarded under a different section of the Treasury's final rule, do not need quite the same level of justification. So there will be a reduced justification requirement for these particular rules. The application procedure is largely the same other than that, in which case I believe we should probably recommend changing the language we discussed for the last chapter to conform. That we bring that language over and put it in this chapter as well regarding federal funds and federal grants. In addition to making the CFR site correction on the first page. The evaluation criteria used by the board are whether the project is eligible, whether the project will inure to the benefit of the citizens of the state, and whether the project represents a prudent use of the fund. And then the office will again compute a scorecard for each project based on a number of criteria that were developed by the Office of State Lands in conjunction with DEQ and the Water Development Office. And then the funding, disbursement, and administration provisions are all largely the same. So I would just add to whatever motion comes out that we change the CFR site and that we change the reporting requirements in 7C7. And I believe you can incorporate those into the director's recommendation so that we're good moving forward.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Questions? Comments? It appears to me that the same language that we just talked about is also under consideration, and this time it is section 7C7. So if, is there any further discussion on that? If not, I would entertain a motion, if that's appropriate.
Mr. Chairman,
Madam Auditor.
I would move the same language that sorry, this is clunky. I would move the same language that we put in the prior set of rules to the applicable section in this set of rules.
So thank you, Madam Auditor. So if memory serves, the amount of any CARES grants awarded by the state and any ARPA state and local fiscal recovery funds the applicant has received, and a brief summary of how the funds were spent, comma, or planned to be spent.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Is that correct? Okay, thank you.
And the Scrivener's change. Yeah.
So it has been moved. Is there a second?
Second.
It's been seconded by the secretary. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Okay, that motion carries. Now the matter of C2 is before us. What is the pleasure of the board?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would move the director's recommendations, the ones we received this morning. I don't know if that clarifies it.
Yeah, you're talking about the June 10th, 22 draft. Is that correct?
Mine actually says June 13th amended attachments, June 10th. Maybe that's what you're referring to, sir. But I believe so then.
Okay. Madam Director?
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I think we're okay, conferring with council here.
I'm just looking at the sheets that were left on this morning, and at the top it says amended June 10th.
Yes, that's the one, Mr. Chairman, with the date June 13th on the far left margin.
Fair enough. Very good. Perfect. Thank you. It's been moved. And it was seconded, is that correct, by the superintendent? Is there any further discussion? Any further discussion? Any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
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 That motion carries. Thank you. Madam Director.
Mr. Chairman, I believe that concludes the agenda for the special State Loan and Investment Board meeting today.
Thank you, Madam Director. Thank you, members of the board. Thank you, Jeremiah, very much for being here. Thanks to the staff. I would entertain a motion to adjourn unless there's further comments. Madam Director.
Mr. Chairman, just one comment so that folks can understand next steps. As soon as we get through all of the administrative piece of getting the emergency rules in place, we will then open up the application period. Likely that's going to be next week. We don't have a specific date, but it's our intention to begin to move forward as quickly as we can. We will send out a Gov delivery notice. We will put things on the website, and I believe there are plans to do some further outreach and advertising in some of the local newspapers.
Thank you, Madam Director. Any other comments? Hearing none, I'd entertain a motion to adjourn. It's been moved by the superintendent, seconded by the treasurer. All in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Thank you. We are adjourned.